Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. Episode 601. We're over the old 600 hill, counting down to episode 1200. So this show will go on 26 years, or I guess 28 maybe? I guess we're almost at the 14th anniversary. I'm sure Naomi would love to hear that. Another 14 years of you sitting in the office and hearing you yelling through the wall. Anyway, this is a very good episode today. This is Rod Argent. If you don't know who Rod is, I'm going to read you his bio right now. Originally from St. Albans, musician Rod Argent became the founder, keyboard player, and one of the principal songwriters of the seminal 1960s British rock band The Zombies at the age of 16. While the band only stayed together a little more than half a decade, they became international stars, and their final album, Odyssey and Oracle, is both one of the most acclaimed albums of the 1960s and of all time. After the Zombies broke up, Rod formed the brilliant prog band Argent, highly recommended, which played through the mid-70s, and since then, Rod has recorded 10 albums under his own name. While the Zombies have reformed here and there, in 2004 they began to record music together again, and their latest album, Different Game, was just released in March this year, and like everything the band does, it is a real delight. This was very exciting. I've been a fan of the Zombies since I was a child. They've gotten in my head, them, the Beatles, and the Monkees in terms of songwriting and getting pop structures cemented in my neurons. I gotta say, for being an international rock star, Rod is an incredibly nice dude. In fact, I didn't want to hide it, but basically, I have Spectrum here in Los Angeles. It is a terrible service, especially for the amount of money that we pay for the service. And about 12 minutes in, the internet just shut down. I had to create a hotspot, and Rod was incredibly nice and understanding. And a lot of times, if there's someone coughs or has to, get up from their desk, or I have to let the cat out of the office, I cut that stuff out. But I thought, just in case it changed the energy of I just listened back to it. I don't think it does, but just in case, as the listener, it changed the energy of our talk. I didn't want to disguise that there had been a 8-minute break where I ran around the apartment sweating, being like, what the fuck am I going to do? So yeah, that's why there's that little break. I didn't try to disguise it in there. And again, Rod, what a nice guy. We talk all about growing up in post-war Britain, and I won't spoil it, but some of the people in his hometown, or some of the people that were hanging out in 1950s England, kind of blew my mind. Maybe you know about it, but anyway, I hope you enjoy this episode. If you do, why not subscribe to the show? Why not leave a review on Apple Podcasts? Can you do that anywhere else? Well, at least do it on Apple Podcasts. I'm at Andy Beckerman on Twitter. Again, I don't know why you would go there at this point. I basically write a couple jokes every day and then look for information about the WGA strike, because you know what's happening. Basically, they're in negotiations at the moment, and every day, the AMPTP, which is the conglomerate of all the studios and networks, they put out some kind of shady press release to try to make the WGA look bad, and then you go on Twitter, and all of the top WGA people are all like, don't read it. It's terrible. It's dumb. It's not true. And basically what the AMPTP is trying to do is destroy our morale and destroy our solidarity. But we just go on Twitter and get the real news. So I don't know what they're trying to pull. But anyway, if you want Twitter, Blue Sky, I suppose, Instagram, that's where you can get pictures mostly of the cats and dogs and Naomi. So I guess that's how that breaks down. Next week, Fat Tony. I loved his album 10,000 Hours. His new one, I Will Make a Baby in This Damn Economy, is great. So look forward to that. But for now, let's talk to Rod. I was thinking about this morning when I was thinking about talking to you. I'm on month 4 of the writer's strike here in America, and we've been picketing outside of the studios for 4 months now in the sun.
My goodness.
Yeah, it's not great. And I mean, it's great in the sense that there's a lot of solidarity among the writers, and the actors now have joined us. I was thinking, I was like, wait a second, you were 16, I think, when the Zombies formed, right? How did you avoid, or maybe you didn't, but I'm curious, and this is just a businessy question, but I'm like, how did you avoid not getting exploited at 16? Because I had my first job in my 30s and I was exploited.
Well, the answer to that, Andrew, is that we didn't. I mean, I didn't, and we didn't avoid getting exploited. We tried to protect ourselves in any way that we could. But as you so rightly say, we were 16 years old, and in fact, we were 18 when we got our first recording deal, and I wrote the first song that was to become a huge hit, which was She's Not There. And in fact, everywhere we went, and as we approached, famous practitioners like lawyers or particularly managers, we would try to protect ourselves because we were aware of the pitfalls, but we were just too young to protect ourselves properly. And we found ourselves entering areas where other people were much smarter than us, and they didn't always have the best motives. They just wanted to feather their own nests, and they did it at our expense and in spite of our best efforts to stop those happening. And, we weren't the only people. It happened almost universally. And later in our careers, when we became more savvy, we were able to put obstacles in the way of people that wanted to do us wrong, if you like. But, we were exploited awfully at the beginning. And I think it actually made a huge difference to particularly our career in the UK, because we've always been musicians, and I certainly have always felt that everything I do, I should do for real. And in other words, when I started playing rock and roll, it was because that felt like my whole life. I always identified with John Lennon's early comment that when he said, when I was young, the real world to me was music. And what went on in what other people call the real world, to me, was a little bit of a mirage, In fact, everything that felt really essential and real to me was music. And that was the place where I felt at home, always. For instance, you said that the show is very much about how one has approached things throughout one's life, etc. And music was always very important to me. When I was, my dad was a semi-pro musician. He had a semi-pro dance band from the age of 17 to the age of 83. He ran his own dance band. And my mother was a part of a large family, all who were amateur musicians, but really into music. She got me involved. I always enjoyed, right from being, sort of 4 and 5 years old, I enjoyed hearing the general popular songs of the day in an interested sort of form. I always found music easy to practice, in the sense that it always made sense to me, and I always sort of saw it visually. And I remember my parents buying me a harmonica when I was really young. How old was I? I don't know. I must have been 7 or 8 years old or something. And I could immediately get a tune out of it because I could sort of see in my mind the scale. I could see when, what we know now as whole tones and then half tones, lengths of tones, So in a scale, you've got a whole note, then a half note in terms of time, and then a whole note, then a whole note, then a whole note and a half note. That just appeared visually to me, really, in a way. So the minute I picked up the harmonica, I could get a tune out of it. And I found that on the piano as well. We always had a piano in our house because Dad, it didn't often play in the house, but anyway. And my mum wanted me to get involved. We came from a very working class household, very working class estate that we were on. But my mum wanted me, and really unusually for people in that living where we lived, etc. She wanted me to try out for to be a chorister, a treble, when I was a young boy, in the cathedral, the St Albans Cathedral, and I got in. And she really encouraged that whole part of things. And actually, in retrospect, that was a fantastic experience for me, because it meant that, for instance, I heard, it was a lot of music. We had a service, a boys' service that we had to sing on Monday evenings, Tuesday evenings, Thursday evenings. Then there was a full choir practice with men on the Friday. Then a full men's choir on Saturdays and Sundays. So lots and lots of music.
Yeah, that's a lot.
I found myself being exposed to music I would never have heard otherwise. And it was, in a sense, I've always thought of it as being 400 years of some of the finest music ever written. And I remember the very first time I heard Bach, it was because we had a young, new master of music, an organist, who became one of the premier Bach organists in the world, actually. But he was a great guy. And I remember one of the first things he did was to put on a performance of Bach's St. Matthew Passion. And because I was a treble, I was involved in it with the choir. And I remember there was a small orchestra that he got along with the organ to perform in the choir. And I remember the first chorus, singing it, and I just melted. And it felt to me as if I'd come home. It just felt, yeah, this is exactly what music should be. And it made the world, it intensified the world, just made it more real. Now, this was at exactly the same time as I first heard Elvis sing Hound Dog, and on the really early rock and roll. And that turned me on 100% just as much. And I just wanted to hear the rawest rock and roll I could lay my hands on, like Little Richard, Elvis and Jerry Lee at the time, all the classic people, Ray Charles very soon after that. It was just a fantastic experience. And that felt like the real world to me. And I didn't make any distinction between singing it in a Bach chorus and then hearing Elvis sing Hound Dog, or Lordy Miss Claudie, or Little Richard singing Lucille. It just felt just as, bringing me to the center of how I felt I was. And that was the real world for me. So that was always my experience, and from the earliest days. And I think in the long term, the fact of being exposed to so much classical music, just almost by a sort of osmosis, it inculcated a real feeling, a natural feeling of how harmony should be, where harmonies existed. And actually, that transferred itself to rock and roll. I mean, people think it's mad when you talk like that, but it isn't. These are, because rock and roll really obviously came from initially, black music getting from Africa, getting involved with white hymns and all that sort of thing, and the two merging together and actually making something very spiritual, very important to the people that were singing it, but with huge amount of soul and feel. And there's so much soul in Bach, actually, but there is also, obviously, in the early rock and roll and the early stuff I heard of Ray Charles. I still have evenings here where I just play my very earliest Ray Charles records. It's a blessing, actually, to have been exposed to all that and to be able to not do one to the exclusion of the other. And actually, strangely enough, as I've gone through life, I've come across multiple examples of people like Rachmaninoff, who used to go and spend nights in jazz clubs listening to Art Tatum. And he actually said to Art Tatum once, if you ever decided to play classical music, we'd all be in trouble. And this was Rachmaninoff. And so the great musicians don't make those distinctions. They really don't. And I know that when Stravinsky first came to the States, I always remember his first press conference. It was a really big deal because he was emigrating to the States, and all the classical music luminaries were there, to meet him and say, Mr. Stravinsky, what is the first thing you're going to do when you're over here? And he said, I'm going to go and listen to Duke Ellington. And they didn't even know who Duke Ellington was, but the guys like him and right up to Leonard Bernstein, who loved every form of music really, and was a great classical musician, but loved jazz and loved all these things. That their ears are open to everything, and they think for real on everything. So I don't know quite how I got diverted into that, into all that, but there you go.
There's a lot there, but I think we can backtrack through some of it. But one of the things I think that this just hit me as you were talking, but I wonder if there's something special about the 60s where everything started to open up a little bit and start to merge in that way, in that it hadn't in previous decades. And I wonder if that's some of the specialness of the 60s.
I think it was. And I think that particularly in the UK, we've been through a time of great hardship. And no one had any money. Everything was rationed. There was nothing. It was a very cold, hard time and brutal time for people. And suddenly, by the advent of rock and roll around 56, 57, that things started to open up. There was a little bit more money.
I remember exactly where we were, though. I was saying that the 60s, it feels like that was a time when like everything was kind of opening up. Like the thing that made it special was that suddenly everything was opening up and there was all this crossover. And that's kind of like the stew that you formed in a little bit.
I mean, there was a huge crossover and everyone was listening to, certainly in the UK. I mean, because it always struck me from my early trips to America that the radio stations, which played far more music and far more records than we ever heard at the time, but they were very specialized in the sense that there were black stations. They had what they called race stations at that time over there, and there were the white stations, and sometimes the music on the two sorts of stations were totally separate. No one was there wasn't a lot of crossover. Obviously, people like Elvis were listening to some black stations, and that's where they got their feeling for black music. And people like Buddy Holly were managing to do that as well. So a few people that was going on with, but so often they were very, very specialized. There were very many fewer ways to listen to music in the UK, but everybody was listening to all sorts of music. And I think that I know when the Beatles first started in the UK, which was 62 rather than 64, as it was in the American case, they were in a port city, which was Liverpool. And a lot of the merchant seamen were continually going to New York. And they were checking into the great jazz clubs that were there and listening to people like Miles and Charlie Parker a bit before that, so they had that in their consciousness and everything as well. And also people like the Beatles from the record shops were getting imported records of Motown stuff and a lot of the black popular music that was going on at the time. So we were an early rock and roll in the UK was leading people, even before I was involved in it, back in the 50s, was leading people to discover Ray Charles and all the sort of bluesy and soulful things that were going on. And there was a great crossover. And a lot of people that I know at the time that were in some of the seminal UK groups were listening to a lot of jazz as well. And I mean, I was particularly turned on to the Miles Davis group of 1958 or so, with Cannonball Adderley, John Coltrane, before Kind of Blue. Milestones was the first album that I bought and that I absolutely fell in love with. And we were listening to that at the same time as we were listening to Little Richard and Elvis and the people that I've already mentioned to you, and the rawest rock and roll and the early rhythm and blues. And we were even tuning into what some black music that at the time in urban US was regarded as being old-fashioned black music. You know, people like Howlin' Wolf and John Lee Hooker, and people like the Beatles, and were having a conduit to that music that was affecting everyone. Everybody was listening to everything. I remember John Steele, the drummer in the Animals, saying that when he played House of the Rising Sun, the drum part on that, he was imagining he was playing Walk on the Wild Side by Jimmy Smith. He was using the same groove, the same feel, you know. So you had all that crossover going on, and that was a very fruitful time for the beginnings of the sort of revolution that was going on in the mid 50s and the early 60s, and I think that was one of the differences between UK and America. I mean, everything that we were listening to, that we were turned on to in music, came from America. Everything. We thought we were just recycling it, and people were going to hate it when they heard it in America. But after it had gone through the English filter, it turned out to be something of its own. And it started to have its own character, and maybe with all these different influences, and even some of the classical musical influences that people were listening to that I said too.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think that is the ingredient. When you were saying that, that's the thing that kind of like sparked something in my head where I'm like, oh yeah, of course it is Bach. It is these other these classical influences that are now sneaking in that have changed everything, especially that like harmony in the way that you use it, you know, in the way it's in the Beatles. There's so many where I'm like, oh right, that's how it mutates. It gets that into its DNA.
Yes, and it does get into the DNA. You're absolutely right, because it was never a conscious decision. You know, when we were making our first early records, I was never thinking, oh, I must use a bit of what I've heard from Miles, or I must use a bit of what I've heard from Bach. You never thought about that at all. You thought you were just playing rock and roll. But because you'd had such a big canvas of what was around that you were listening to, and all the things, especially when you're so, your mind is so open when you're that age to what you hear. If it really turns you on, it doesn't matter where it comes from, and you get very excited about it. And music is very important to you. You know, if you basically become a jazz musician or a rock and roll musician, the passion that you feel about it when you're 14 years old and you're first really finding your way with it is huge. You know, it just fills your whole life, and it makes everything worthwhile. And that's part of being that age, I think. You know, it's part of how people feel, the passion they feel when they're that young. And I think that was one of the differences. And when you think you're just being a rock and roll band, these things are creeping in without you even knowing it, and they're changing what you initially might have copied. You know, so it becomes something of its own.
I mean, earlier you were saying that it felt like, you know, music was always there. It was always around you. But I'm really curious, was there a moment when you actually chose it? Or do you think it was just that, well, we formed this band and then suddenly it became huge, and I almost was like carried along in the torrent?
Well, the thing was, when I first heard Elvis, it was my cousin, who was 4 years older than me, Jim Rodford, who later became the bass player with the Kinks on their biggest ever selling records. But he was in one of the first, 4 years older than me. So I was 11 and he was 15. And he'd already formed a skiffle group. And he actually played a T-chest and string bass, which he retained the ability to do to the end of his life, actually. He could get a fantastic sound out of a T-chest and a piece of string, and putting a mic in the T-chest, you know, absolutely unbelievable. But I was 11 when I first heard his band, and one of the earliest bands in the south of England, and playing that sort of music. And I was completely gobsmacked when I heard that. And then I remember the day he played me, I was singing Hound Dog, and I can picture myself in that room with him. And he became a sort of mentor to me. He lived 400 yards away from me, and he always sort of took care of me and became a mentor. And he had a group called the Blue Tones, and he loaned us. I mean, when I first managed to get a group of people together to form a band, which was pretty much the first version of the Zombies, apart from the bass player, he loaned us all the Blue Tones gear. He drove me, because I was too young to drive. He drove me to the rehearsal hall. That was the first time I ever met Colin. And we just, had our first rehearsal. We thought we were pretty hot playing on the Blue Tones gear. We really did. And Jim, many years later, because he played with us for years and years, and became a founder member of Argent with me. But he said he thought no chance when he first heard us. But in the end, we beat his band in a beat contest, which led to our first recording contract with Decca. And so, it was a bit ironic, really. But he was a huge enabler for me throughout his life. And he died in a really tragic accident, actually, just after an American tour, when he fell down the stairs and at home and hit the back of his head. And his wife found him in the morning. Oh. I mean, it was very tragic, but he was a huge enabler for me, and I can't remember how we got onto that, but which happens all the time with me. But nevertheless, and hearing Elvis, and I just thought, my God, this is like music from another universe, and I just couldn't imagine any English musician, and there were rock and roll musicians in England trying to copy Elvis at the time, and they were very weak copies at the time. They really were in the mid 50s, but generally speaking, and nothing like the soul and the informed feeling of sort of the black music underneath that these guys had heard in America, and had started to translate into very early rock and roll. But it led all of us to listen to people like Ray Charles and some of the early blues people, as I said, as well. So it got us onto that roundabout. But then just 8 years later, I was only 18. In fact, 7 years later, from when I first was 11 and heard Hound Dog, and thought, there's no way I'd ever be able to get near this music, but I have to try, because it's just filled my life. It's fantastic. And 7 years later, we headlined a show in the Brooklyn Fox, playing immediately after people like Patti LaBelle, and playing with some of our heroes like Benny King and the Drifters. It's just the most wonderful collection of people. We thought they were going to hate us. We really did. And we went in to do a sound check. There we were, 5 skinny English guys, 18 years old. And we had to sound check after Patti LaBelle. And I was so scared. We got on stage and played. We thought, they're going to hate us. They're going to say this pale imitation of American music. They didn't hear it like that. And they loved it. And we became real friends. Patti LaBelle we used to go into her dressing room every night after the show, and she would talk about black church music. And I remember her saying to me, there's this new kid on the block that you've got to check out. Her name's Aretha Franklin. and at the time, she wasn't even doing the soul stuff that she later did. She was doing the CBS more cabaret stuff that she started her life out with. And she said, and there's this other black singer you've got to try and hear, called Nina Simone. We'd never heard of her, so we immediately picked up all her albums in New York, took them all home with us, and were then some of the earliest people in the UK, because in the to really get turned on to these wonderful artists. But they heard it as a different music, and they became informed by the sort of recycling that we'd done and brought back to them, and turned into something of our own with some of these influences that I've already mentioned. Everything from jazz to classical music to the things that weren't necessarily part of the mix in the UK.
I mean, you're born at the tail end of World War II.
Yeah.
Was St. Albans untouched by the war, or was it rebuilding when you were a kid?
It wasn't. It wasn't like the East End of London. It wasn't demolished like the East End of London was, but it did have war damage. Yeah, and bomb damage. And I remember my mother telling me about the times that they were most scared, were when the doodlebugs were first invented, and they heard these things whistling overhead and moving away, and then there'd be silence because the last part of it was silent, and then they were just waiting then for where it was going to land and when the explosion was, and windows were blown out and things like that. I mean, nothing like the Ukraine today, where the Russians with these ridiculous missiles can, just destroy everything in their path, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, modern warfare is so scary. Well, any warfare is scary, but no. But there was damage in St Albans. I mean, it's a small historic city, but it's one of the oldest cities in the UK. At one point in Roman Britain, it was the capital. It was called Verulamium at the time. So it was a small place, but it was always important in its own way. And it had this beautiful cathedral that I'd already said that I was a member. My mum had got me as a member of the choir there at the cathedral, and that was untouched by bombs. So there was some bomb damage, but it got away much more lightly than many places. Many of the big industrial places got very, very hard hit.
I asked that because I'm kind of curious about the atmosphere of the city when you are a child. Is there hope? Is it like, oh, the war's over, we can rebuild? Do you feel desolation, and is music a refuge? I mean, I'm painting like a very linear picture, but I'm kind of curious about, because you said that music surrounded you, I was wondering, what like emotional role did it play in your life, in your childhood?
Well, I mean, the emotional role was everything. I mean, as I've already said to you, that was what felt like reality to me, was music. I mean, that was the real world to me, without any question. That was the only place I felt really at home. I was always a shy guy, and people that see us on stage now can't believe it, because basically I am still reasonably introverted and fairly shy. I mean, I've got some good friends and everything, but I'm not one of those people that gets all his energy from being an extrovert, in the sense that when people are around, it gives you huge energy. That's never been the case with me. My energy has generally come from inside myself. And when I've been doing creative things, like I've had some very successful production projects, record production projects. But if there's a problem during part of the recording, I have to go away and let the inside of myself come up with a solution. My colleague, who was a great guy, Peter Van Hook, who was the drummer with Van Morrison and had many other roles. He's complete extrovert in the sense that his way of working out any problems was to be in the studio. He couldn't do it away. I would walk away and work on it. Pete would come in, and it was with people around him that the problem would be sorted. And we were a good combination because of that. But basically, I'm a fairly shy bloke, and that's why. But a lot of people, they see us on stage, and people that I've known, for instance, in my present house, we've been here for 8 years now, and it's a great little town here. And I've got to know a few people in it, and there's for instance this cafe owner that's always been a lovely guy, but he came to see us for the very first time at an English festival that we did this summer. And he just couldn't believe it. He said, "You're a completely different person when you're on stage." He said, "I can't believe it. You're not the person that I've known at all." And it's that thing. And you find quite a few, not everybody, but quite a few artists are like that they become their real selves on stage. Whereas when they're off, they're often more introverted. I don't mean it in a clinical way. I don't mean in a medical way or anything like that. But just as we're all either a mixture of extrovert and introvert. And my scale, I've never liked networking. I've never done it. I've always run away from it. Mm-hmm. Whereas our bass player, who was a big friend of mine, Chris White, we were in production. We were colleagues for many years, and I love him to death. but he's always been a networker all his life, but not just to make life financially better for himself. That's just his natural personality. He just loves mixing. He mixes very easily with anyone that's famous in the room and becomes their instant friend, and that's just his personality. It's just how we're different. But in St Albans, during that time, first of all, in the rock and roll explosion with Bill Haley and then Elvis and some of the early English rock and rollers, that was a Teddy Boy era. And Teddy Boys used to roam around the town with sort of flick knives and things, and most of them were fine. But but there was a lot of violence going on at that time in the 50s, and they always used to wear Edwardian costumes. That's why they were called Teddy Boys.
Wait, sorry, what? there were
Edwardian.
There were
costumes.
Kids in Edwardian costumes with switchblades wandering around.
I mean, what I mean by that is they would have long jackets, really long jackets with velvet collars that were based on Edwardian, and they would have they'd have skin tight jeans. I've got skin tight jeans now, but this was way back. And they'd have these shoes that had sort of foam soles or crepe soles, about that thick, and they had very much greased back hair, like a cross between Elvis and Elvis was their hero. He was absolutely their hero, and sort of James Dean and all that sort of thing. And they were the young tearaways of that time. But when they got drunk, you had to be really careful because they did have flick knives and things. And if they took against you, took umbrage, or if they were drunk, you had to be really careful, especially if you were a young guy, walking into a chip shop or something and getting a bag of chips, and the wrong person was there. You had to really be careful with yourself. That was the 50s. In the 50s, I was only, from 10 years old. I was 10 in 55. And so by 1960, just before the mod era, that was the dangerous bit that you had to watch out for. But, this is like sort of hooligans anywhere.
Right.
And then after that, things really quietened down, and it was great. And then you got the mods versus the rockers, and the mods all had their Lambrettas and Vespas, scooters, and the rockers had their big motorbikes, and were still looking back to the Teddy Boy days, So the two of them used to love clashing with each other on bank holidays and things, and you'd have real fights and people would get injured, etc., etc. And then the mods talked about that, and people like the Who talked about that in being and they used to go down to the seaside and everything, and there'd be big gangs of them coming up against each other, all that sort of thing, and that was the 60s. But nevertheless, there was this huge feeling that for the first time, young people were a separate entity to being just young adults and sons and daughters of older people, whereas before that, just after the war, people were very, it's in the mid 40s, for instance, people were very much young copies of their parents, and they would dress like their parents, and all this was going on. And then suddenly youth was finding an identity of its own, whether it was the Teddy Boys and the Rockers or the Mods later on, or people identifying with the Beatles, because suddenly mass communication was much more evident, and records became, hugely universal. And it was very, very exciting in different sorts of ways. But at the same time, there was a huge, huge optimism going on. Suddenly there was money for young people for the first time. Suddenly young people were being taken seriously in fashion, in art, in pushing the boundaries of music. They could become successful at a really young age, and become important and influential at a really young age. And that was a real change. and it had a feeling of power. And there were times in the 60s where we all felt everything was possible. In the UK, the English soccer team won the World Cup, and it just seemed. And then the Beatles made this huge impression in America about 2 years after they'd come out in the UK, and it felt like suddenly, from never being able to get a foothold in America or meaning anything in American music, suddenly America was looking, to people like the Beatles. And then, to some extent, She's Not There was the first record with a self-written record to top the American charts after the Beatles. And we made the 9 o'clock news for that. I remember phoning up my mum, which was a big deal in those days. Phone up home was, it took you used to have to book a call, and it took hours to get through. A bit like our thing here, just running out of power. Anyway, I said, I managed to get through, and she said, "You've just been on the 9 o'clock news." And I thought, oh my God, what have I done? But in fact, it was because they'd said we were another English band after the Beatles, for the first English band to top the American charts with a self-written composition. So it was pretty incredible and fantastical, or what's the word? It was pretty dreamlike for us. I mean, there you are, 18, and everybody wants to know you, and you could, all the girls want to see you, and want to be with you and everything. And it was just, it was for a teenage boy doing what you felt your center was, and what you'd rather be doing than anything else in the world was making rock and roll music that people were taking seriously, and at the same time, all these peripheral things like that. All the girls wanted to know you and everything as well. It was just a dream. I mean, absolutely crazy.
How were you even set up to handle that? Because that seems like such a huge leap. Were your parents grounded people, and so they raised you in a grounded way? Because it just seems, like you said, dreamlike. I don't know how I would handle that kind of sudden fame.
It's a very hard thing to handle, but at the same time, I think all the guys in our band had very grounded family life, and I mean, my parents were fabulous, actually. They always tried to instill in me and my sister, a sense of what was important, and to take other people in an important way, and how important it was to do things for the right reason, and how important it was to do what you really felt you wanted to do. When I say you wanted to do, I don't mean a whim. I mean what was your real center, and to develop whatever real talent you had, if you had any, but it doesn't matter if you didn't, because the important thing is to be genuine and to care for other people and take other people seriously, but to do what you felt was real in your life and always follow that. And that's something which I think prepared me for my whole life, really. I mean, when we go out on tour now, when we make a new record like the album we've just made, we're doing it for real. We're only doing it. The only reason I'm doing this is not to try and cash in on what's happened before. It's because I've got this enormous privilege of being in my later 70s and being able to still feel fulfilled and still do things for real in exactly the same way as I did when I was 18 years old. And that's such a privilege. I don't think there are very few other careers that you can express yourself in that way. And then when you're on stage for that couple of hours, I mean, the touring life is as tedious and as hard as ever. Mm-hmm. But for that hour and 3/4 or whatever it is when you're on stage, there's no difference, I swear to you, to the energy that you feel than when you were 18 years old. And you're doing it for exactly the same reasons and getting the same feeling of satisfaction from, if you get a night, for instance, where everything seems easy. I mean, this happens, it doesn't happen all the time, happens occasionally, when you're playing a solo and suddenly it feels like you can do anything. Other nights you always play your very best that you can, but and you're still enjoying it, but you're working at it all the time and trying to make things work. There are occasional nights where you might be doing a solo and you go in a different direction and you think this is so easy, and everything becomes easy. And that is the most glorious feeling in the world. And to be able to still feel that at our age and get a reaction from a section of the audience that was the same age as we were when we started. I mean, that was unlooked for. The fact that you can still seem to be able to relate to a section of the audience who are maybe 20, 21 years old.
Yeah.
I mean, whoever would have thought that? I mean, it's crazy, but it's a wonderful feeling, to think that, my God, I wrote this song when I was 18 and someone's being affected by it now,
Yeah.
at the same sort of age. I think it's such a rare place to be, and I'm forever thankful for that.
Yeah, for sure. Do you think your parents were that was just the way they were, where they encouraged you to follow your dreams? Or do you think it was a function of having lived through the war, that they were just like, you might as well just do what you want to do?
I think that living through the war did change them, as it changed everybody of their generation. I mean, my mum was one of 8 kids, and there's a picture that I love that I've got, or we have somewhere anyway, of my mum and her 3 sisters and 4 brothers in a group picture with my mum's mum and dad as well. And my mum told me they took that picture because it was as the war was breaking out, and they didn't know how many of her children were going to be alive at the end of the war, because they thought all the 4 boys were going to be in the army or the navy or the air force, and they were in all 3 services. My uncle missed being captured into a Japanese prisoner of war camp by the fact that he had a septic finger when his navy division was being sent out to Japan, and they stopped him going, and they said, "You can't go, you've got a septic finger." And so he didn't go, and the rest of his company were imprisoned in a Japanese prisoner of war camp, and probably most of them didn't come back. So there was that feeling that they'd lived through this time and they'd come through it virtually unscathed, and they had a feeling of really what was real in life, and the fact that my mum, adored her parents to the end of her life, etc. Very lucky. I thought that all families were like that, and it was years before I found out that that wasn't the case. That most families weren't like that. Most families were at each other's throats, or maybe, or at least in the extended family, were at each other's throats, But and that just wasn't my experience. So felt very emotionally grounded in that way. And there was a lovely moment because we were a very working class family. But as I said before, my mum got me involved in the choir, which was very unusual. She got me into a public school. Now, a public school is what would be a private school to you, and it's only called public over here because it was the first time in the sort of 15th century that the public, other than the clergy, were allowed to be taught, in schools. That's where the name public school comes from in the UK. But everything from sort of Eton to, but anyway, this was a minor public school, and I managed to get a scholarship there. And so, and even though my education was paid for because they couldn't have afforded it privately, they still had to make a lot of sacrifices because my dad, just had a working man's wage, and I had to have I still had to have all the clothes and the bits and pieces that you have to, go through all that. And then I got a place at university, which was really unusual at the time, but I had the chance of turning professional at that moment. And I remember talking to my mum and dad one evening and saying, "Look, can I talk to you about this? Because, we've got a chance to be professional with the zombies, And they were fantastic because after everything they'd gone through, and they thought they'd managed to, help me get into, a slightly higher grade or whatever you want to call it in life, or the chance of that. both my mum and dad said, "Is this 100% what you really want to do? And be serious about this." And I said, "Yes, it's really what I want to be. You know, music's everything to me. I want it." And they said, "Fine, go for it." And that was really lovely. I just thought that was the most beautiful reaction. And in fact, at the time, I then wrote to the university and said, and at the time, rock and roll was so looked down on by the educational establishment. It was like, you know, it was almost subhuman in the way some people thought about it. And they wrote me this beautiful thing back saying, basically saying what my parents had said, saying, "Go for it." And they said, "If you find that things aren't working out over after a year or so, give us another call." And I thought that was I just thought, my God, things are changing. You know, the way I'm getting, even maybe that was an unusual response from a university, but you know, to get that, I thought was great. But my parents were always lovely about it, and they always supported me 100%. So, and I was an only child until I was 10 and a half, and then I got a sister who I'm close to now, still. And I'm you know, it's great to have her. My mum lived till she was nearly 101, and she was great throughout her life. She had dementia in the last 2 years, but that was all.
Wow.
So you know, I was very, very lucky like that, and the way I was supported, and not everyone had the same experience.
The last question: what do you think you would have done if you had gone in that other direction? Did you have something where you thought, well, this piqued my interest, or were you just kind of like going through those motions as music was your reality?
Well, music was my reality, but at the same time, academically, I was only ever good at one thing, and that was literature and writing. And for instance, there were times in when I first went into senior school that they had A, B, and C forms, and they used to give the same exam in each of the subjects to the whole year. And they would write the A form in blue, the B form in red, or it might be the other way around, and the C form in pencil. Now, by the time I got to the upper school, I'd moved up, but I was in the C form because my prowess at the sciences, particularly maths, but everything like geography. I'm trying to think anything. The only thing I was good at was I was good at history, but not exceptional. But I was exceptionally good at writing and at literature. And in fact, I used to come top of the whole year of the A, B, and C forms, even though I was in the C form. There'd be this one pencil mark at the top of the thing. So that was my one. You know, everything else I was hopeless at. But and the school was great. I mean, Stephen Hawking went to that school.
Oh, wow.
Tim Rice was there. The guy that played the manager, the first prefect I ever noticed at school when I first joined it was a guy called Ian Hendra, who in Spinal Tap was the manager. In Spinal Tap, that was Ian Hendra. But anyway, there were some pretty good people at the school. But and that was mixed, and they could never work out what I was at school because I was in the choir, I was in the cathedral choir, it was the buildings of the school. They were 1,000 years old, and the church is 1,000 years old. And part of the building of the church was originally a monastery, was St Albans School, and you know, we used to do our prep, our homework in one of those buildings, etc., etc. But the headmaster, who was a real snob and an ex-naval man, he could never work me out at all, because I remember I went to a holiday camp when I was 15, just self-taught musician, and I won the piano contest there, and he just couldn't work it out at all, and he knew that I was he knew that I was in the choir, and that I used to, you know, be a soloist in the choir and everything, and that I found music and reading music very easy. I'd only ever been really thoroughly taught to read music within the choir, but I always found it easy. It just felt natural to me, and not a task. It did come to me easily. So music and literature and writing, came easy to me. So I thought that if I hadn't managed to get any sort of record deal, which was pretty remote for anybody in those days, then I would probably end up being a journalist, or something to do with writing. And I've always enjoyed writing, actually. I mean, it's not something I want to do in an extended way now. And for instance, I've been asked several times to write an autobiography, but I'm just really not interested in that at all, for many reasons, actually. But I just, I don't like most rock and roll autobiographies anyway. But but anyway, that's the only thing I was good at. So it would have had to have been something to do with me writing, either as a journalist or in something akin to that.
Wow. Rod, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for bearing with the terrible internet in Los Angeles.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, oh, 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 bye.